Welcome to the third plenary session of this European Health Forum, a new social contract for a resilient recovery. Friends of the European Health Forum, Gustein, we have these three pillars in this conference. Rise like a phoenix. We do need a new understanding of multilateralism. We can't go back to the old normal. We do need a new normal for WHO, for the European Union. It's not an option to continue with our old-fashioned health politics or health policies. No, we have to rise like a phoenix above that, because the pandemic crisis highlighted like a laser zoom where the weaknesses of our systems are locally, regionally, nationally, but very much also on the multilateral level. And I think we highlighted it very well, and especially through the voices of the Global South we had during the conferences among us, we learned that when we talk now about the global pandemic treaty, that it is not only about information sharing in terms of a one-way street, but it is also about technology sharing globally, to share the technologies. It's not about charity. When we talk about the Global South, it's about empowerment. And this all has to be legally binding into a new legal concept framework of a pandemic treaty. I think we saw that very clearly, and the discussions highlighted it very perfectly. We concentrated very much also on the role of Europe, the European Union, in this global concept, and especially what do we have to do to organize and strengthen the European Health Union. The fantastic thing coming out of this pandemic crisis is that we are already stepping forward. The European Commission started the HERA program, this Health Emergency Response Action, which is really very significant to prepare us for future crises. And there's also money dedicated to that, and it's not a little sum which is dedicated here. Think about that we have already 30 billion euros over the next years, so 5 billion euros every year to invest into a better preparedness. And that means, we do need a better understanding for the collaboration and cooperation when it comes to research and development, to overcome market challenges, to stockpiling, joint procurement programs. By the way, this joint procurement program for the COVID-19 vaccine was a true success story on the European level. But also, how to secure the production capacities in the European Union when it comes to securing the supply with medicines, vaccines, and other health devices. But we also learned that investment in primary health care, and very strongly also into a better equipped and suited health workforce in the European Union, that's what we learned in our recent discussions. The last and third plenary session is concentrating on a fascinating topic, because what we learned also is that we have to go beyond health, and that we have to look deeper. And this look deeper shows us that we do need a new concept and a new understanding of a social contract, a new social contract, not only for health, but for our well-being in general. And I really thank Hans Kluge, our regional director of WHO, that he had this impeccable idea to put together a commission, a pan-European commission on health and sustainable development, to rethink the ways how we have to work when it comes to health, yes, but also to a really resilient society, for sustainable developments. I'm very proud and happy that we have Mario Monti among us. It's the chair of this commission. Mario Monti, famous professor of Italy and the Prime Minister and Commissioner of the European Union, that he was capable of putting together this commission and putting together a report which is truly significant. And I'm also happy that we have Martin McKee among us, who will do an interview with Professor Monti, because I think, Martin, and thank you for that, with your scientific team and all your colleagues, Professor Mosiales, etc., to have put together this very groundbreaking evidence report also behind it. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that's what it is about. We have to look beyond health. We have to look deeper. We have to keep health in the driver's seat for the future, because once again, we cannot have resilient health systems if we don't change the way how our societies, how politics is operating. I would like to thank everyone that you participated in this European Health Forum 2021. And I'm looking forward to welcoming you next year when we are celebrating our 25th anniversary. And you can be sure we will rise like a phoenix and leave the old normal behind and get to a new standard. And we will come up with a fascinating Health Forum 2022. Thank you very much and good luck.
And thank you very much indeed, Clemens, for that excellent overview of what's been happening over the last few days. And we're all looking forward to rising like a phoenix and being in Gastein in person next year and meeting together with all the collegiality that goes with that. So before I go into the interview with Professor Monti, let me just offer you a few technical details. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I will be speaking for about the next 30 minutes or so, and then I'll be handing over to Anya Sitaran, who will be moderating a panel discussion about a new social contract for a resilient recovery, linking to the title of the session. During the chat that Mario Monti and I are going to have, we will, as is customary at Gastein, be sharing some cartoons from Floris, who will be interpreting our words, interpreting Mario Monti's words, and putting them into his incredibly clever and entertaining images. But also, because we want to get you to participate, we hope that you will put in some questions for us, for Mario, and in fact for the panelists later on through Slido. And Matthias Satonsky, one of the young Gasteiners, will be facilitating that, be summarizing them and bringing the questions to us. And if you are watching us through Brella, then I think you probably all know by now, but you are able to find the Slido next to the stream in the sidebar, or you can scan the QR code on the screen, or go to app.slido.com and use the keyword EHFGP3. And I think all the guidance is up there on the screen. So with that, can I introduce our guest speaker? It is an enormous pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Mario Monti, who I think you all know. But just to summarize, Mario is an exceptional economist, famous for the development of the Klein-Monti model of work on banks operating under conditions of monopolies, and many other things as well, and the president of Bocconi University. But he also, of course, has been the Prime Minister of Italy, and he has been a European Commissioner responsible for competition and for the internal market. But for the present purposes, he convened the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development at the request of Hans Kluge, and that commission has now reported, and I was very privileged to work with Mario during the course of that work of the commission. So, Mario, if I can ask you, there have been a lot of commissions connected to the pandemic over the last 12 to 18 months. The independent panel by WHO headquarters, different governments have set up inquiries and so on. What's different about the one that you led?
Well, first of all, thank President Auer for inviting me. And it is an enormous pleasure to be with all of you virtually, and particularly with Professor McKee. Martin, you do know that you have been the fundamental beacon for me and for all of us on the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development. It was very daring of me to have accepted Hans Kluge's invitation to chair this rather unique commission. And without you and without Elios Mostialos, I certainly would not even have started to do that. And may I take this opportunity also to congratulate you, Martin, on your very recent appointment to President-elect of the British Medical Association. I feel indirectly, even myself, very honored by this. Now, what is different about this commission? Well, it's for the readers and the recipients of our recommendations to say ultimately. But what I believe you, the other commissioners, and I have done together is really to give a new perspective. But we were ordered by Hans Kluge to do that because we had to put the phenomenon of pandemic into the wider context of policy choices. And this, I believe, is indeed a rather unique feature. This might have made our life a bit more difficult, but I am confident our product, our recommendations, a bit closer to and a bit more understandable by the ultimate decision makers, because we have tried to speak their own language. Now, having been for a while one of them, one of the political decision makers, I know that health normally is not at the center of the scene in policy making, nationally or internationally. And I believe that in all our recommendations, we have tried to introduce something that will have, can I say, a sort of a ratchet effect. We know that at this time, the focus of all the politicians in this world is on the pandemic. But we know that heads of states, heads of government tend to have a one issue at a time mindset. So suppose that next year there is, let's hope not, but some other tragedy or catastrophe, or say the issue of cybersecurity mounts in importance. Well, they will all concentrate on that. Now that there is such a momentum on health, we need to make sure that through some innovations in institutions, in policy processes, and so on, the augmented interest in health policy stays there also in the future. And we will perhaps discuss later on one proposal that we have made to that effect concerning the G20, but also at the national level, we have made many proposals which I hope will not only clarify what to do in the present circumstances, but also how to anchor more solidly for the future overall policy making to the requirements of health and social care policy.
So let me take you back to your recommendations, because there are quite a few recommendations in the report. And I was wondering what you feel are the most important areas to focus on among them.
One is generic, but hugely important. The other one is very specific, and it is equally hugely important in my view. The generic one, which is maybe the most important recommendation, is as I hinted a minute ago, Martin, changing our focus, the way we see health. And I mean, I was until 1 year ago a Joe Bloggs, as people say. So I was one of the billions of everyday citizens outside the health community. I must even confess that I would never have dared to be invited by President Auer to one of these European health fora. Now I made it, but I think I will continue to keep an interest on this fascinating and terribly important subject. So the proposal, well, yes, the first proposal is not aimed at national governments, the European Union, the G20 or the WHO, but is aimed at each of us to change our mindset on how to see health and put health not just in the context of One Health, where so much work has been brilliantly done in the last decades and years in particular, but to introduce health in the broader context of policies. Otherwise, we will never identify and try to act on the fragilities which are not located in the citadel of health or even One Health, but are there out in territories from which the assailants to health may come in the future, as they have come for the pandemic. Excessive social inequalities or discriminations are an aggravant of whatever pandemic or health crisis, but also imperfections and malfunctioning in international coordination is another magnifier, unfortunately, huge multiplier of the evil of pandemics.
Then you were saying about specific areas.
If I may,
a bit of a
as you
delay on
know,
the line.
as you know, Martin, we helped together in our commission an idea which seems to be at an exceedingly high level, but we believe is key for practical purposes. That is, first of all, the WHO needs to be strengthened and be put in conditions to operate more efficiently and with a greater accountability. It must remain at the center of the system. But we also need that the G20, which is a bit of a more agile set of nations working together, the proximity of health ministers and finance ministers be established under the eyes of their heads of governments, so that the formulation of global policies, which the leader of the G20 preside over each 6 or 12 months, do take health concerns deeply into consideration. And that's why we have proposed that the G20 should establish a global health and finance board. Actually, this proposal had legs of its own because it landed on the table of the chair of the G20, the Italian presidency of the G20 this year. Months before our report was published, we talked to them, and now there is a last round of consultations by the presidency with all the member states of the G20 and other organizations, and there is a possibility, not a certainty yet, that at the very end of this month, the 31st of October, when the leaders meet in Rome, progress may be announced, I hope so, on this. And this would really be a key to a changing attitude of all policymakers. You know, I try to help in making things happen. It's very easy, very important, but rather easy to make high-sounding declarations on the need for the centrality of health, even on social contracts, which I agree is very important. But let's also try, in the meantime, to be down to earth and to develop ways, modus operandi, which may facilitate their implementation.
So when you look at the recommendations, some are going to be hard and some of them are going to be easy. You've already alluded to the success that you've already had with the Global Health Board, and I've certainly heard it spoken around Europe that when the two Marios are agreed on something, you and your successor Mario Draghi, things happen. So there are high expectations that that will work. And of course, we hope that it will. But what do you think will be the most difficult of the recommendations?
Well, I think probably to arrive at a really binding nature for the provisions, in particular of the pandemic treaty, because this would meet in a high degree the same difficulties that we have seen in all other areas when there is a step to be made towards reducing the sovereignty of each country. By the way, we should say reducing the apparent sovereignty of each country in favor of a multinational order. I say the apparent sovereignty because can we say that with a fragmented, in spite of the efforts of WHO, with a fragmented governance of health as there is now, as there was in January, February 2020, all national countries were sovereign in matters of health? Not at all. We have seen how devastating the knock-on effect from one country to the other has been. So it's important to intellectually understand that in certain areas, sovereignty, nationally defined, is not feasible. It may have been feasible when people did not travel, etc., etc. No longer now. So to shift to conceding a bit of shared governance to, for example, the WHO, for it to be able to have some binding rules on countries is probably an increase of the effective degree of sovereignty for all, even though it's always disturbing, especially for nationalists everywhere, to have to admit some surrender of a sovereignty, which at any rate is largely theoretical by now.
Well, indeed. And of course, viruses do not carry passports. They do not stop and get checked at borders. So what I want to do now is just to pause briefly, because we do have the audience watching, and they've got Slido, and they're going to be pulling together a word cloud. So the question that they are being asked is, what does building forward better mean to you? And here we can see what people are saying, people who are watching. Combating the climate crisis is coming out there, young people leading the way, equity, sustainability. Let's just watch it for a minute or two. Is that combating the climate crisis is clearly coming out right at the top. Gender equality, focusing on humans, not the economy. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then if I could inequality is now a little bit more prominent. But while we're waiting for that to fill out a bit more, I wonder if I could turn to Floris, who will be revealing how he has interpreted what you've been saying. Floris. Great, thank you very much. So, Mario, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect a little bit on what you saw there in the word cloud in particular, because we do in the Commission you do talk about the many threats to health, many of which are related to what we call the Anthropocene, the way in which humanity is impacting on the planet, both in many ways, global heating, of course, the loss of biodiversity, the implications for One Health, and so on. And of course, we have a lot of engagement by the young Gasteyners in the forum, and I think we now know Greta Thunberg and others have really helped to bring this to the fore and given voice to those young people. We also have sustainability, which was, of course, in the title of your commission, solidarity, more equity. So maybe I could ask you to reflect on some of the words that you see there.
Yes, and I have the immense advantage of being able to do so here at Bocconi today, having sitting next to me a person who is at the same time belonging to youth as an age group and belonging to your group, Martin, not mine, because she's very learned in public health matters. That is Professor Alexandra Torbica, who was immensely helpful, as you know, in the conduct of the activity of our Pan-European Commission. Can I involve her for a moment, Martin? Martin?
Yes.
Can I involve Alexandra for a second?
Yeah, please do. Please do. Sorry.
Hello, Martin.
Yes. What would be your reaction? I will trigger your reaction by saying that seeing all, you see them over there, all these objectives, partial objectives, one tends to say that, well, each of them and all of them are necessary to build forward better, but not just the health system, but our societies as a whole and our, how should I say, peaceful coexistence internationally. What would you, any particular comments on your side, Alexandra?
No, indeed, Mario. I think looking also at these keywords that have came out from the discussion and from our audience, it is I'm also reassured to see that the breadth also of the work that we did in the Commission has covered many of these topics, and the world sustainability and health going hand in hand together. So in that sense, this is not a surprise. Definitely the climate threats is on the top of the list. And today here in Milano, we are witnessing an event, Youth for Climate Change, Fridays for Future, here and close to Bocconi University, which really speaks to how much the young generations are worried about the climate threats, which are on the top of the health threats, as we have also envisaged in our reports. So definitely something that I can fully see both the recommendations of our report referring to, as well as what I personally also feel and see as the priorities for the future.
Can I add a word, Martin, by saying that, of course, the pandemic has been a tragedy, but it has had among its side effects, and this must be exploited fully by the political world, the effect of making people vividly, visually, emotionally, concretely aware of what the consequences may be, even in the future, ever more in the future, if the climate change challenge is not simply addressed, but one. And so, since we see that in Europe, in each of our countries, everywhere in the world, people love to speak about the environment and climate change, but hate to pay the price for that. I think that a continuous pedagogical reference to this pandemic should help a bit.
Indeed. And can I just add my thanks to Alexandra as well for her contributions during the work of the Commission. So I wonder if I could bring our young Gasteiner, Mateusz Satonsky, in, because he's been collating questions from those who are watching. Mateusz, can you tell us what's being talked about?
Yes, thank you, Martin. So a lot of buzz around the session on social media and on Slido as well, and a few questions up there. People, interestingly, have been sharing the recommendations of the Monti Commission on social media as the panel has been going on, so that was great to see. The problem mentioned by Professor Monti of the one policy issue at the time mindset is something that particularly seems to have resonated on social media, and the problem it causes for building a more inclusive, equitable, sustainable policy framework for health in Europe. And an interesting question was asked about whether some more sovereignty in areas of health actually need to be surrendered in order to make this more holistic approach possible. So that was one of the questions up there. And there's also questions on the issues of innovation and multidisciplinarity. So one of the questions on innovating institutions that Professor Monti mentioned is on where is this innovation most needed for resilient recovery? Are we talking about innovation at the level of policy making, at the level of policy implementation, or more fundamentally, even just building the appropriate evidence base? And then a final question, multidisciplinarity, which of course has been mentioned throughout the conference this year, and its importance in addressing the poly-pandemic Europe has been going through and the whole world. How do we ensure that silos are avoided, and how do we ensure that collaborations, multidisciplinary collaborations, are fostered? Are there any processes already in place to facilitate them? So those are the main questions and observations out there at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I might just draw the attention of people who are watching to a piece in the current edition of EuroHealth, which accompanies the forum, which actually addresses explicitly this issue of sovereignty, a piece that I wrote with Scott Greer that might answer some of those questions. On the mindset, Mario, memories fade quickly. We know, at the end of the First World War, people said never again, a war to end wars. But then, of course, we went into the 1920s and 30s. We've had many times when people have said we need to we need to move forward, but then we go back to the old status quo. How are we going to avoid that?
I'm afraid this requires a change in the attitude of political leaders. We certainly would fall back, and we would not even build back better, but destroy back even more. If, in my view, if the two fundamental shortcomings characterizing most of our democratic countries continue to go on unchanged. When I refer to democratic countries, it is because to me they are vastly preferable to other countries and have huge advantages over the less democratic countries. But I think we should find a way, and people should raise, especially the youth, and ask vocally about this change in the political attitudes of leaders, which changes. One, to stop narrowing more and more to the very short term the horizon into which political choices are made. Politicians caring just about the next elections or next week public opinion poll if the elections are 1 or 2 years to come. So short-termism. And the other thing is very similar. The other aspect of short-termism is, let's say, is short-sightedness over time. But there is also short-sightedness over space, and that is to pretend that problems which are transnational inherently in their nature could be addressed by national measures. This is impossible. So I believe that these two very, very widespread vices of political decision-making have brought us, well, to have immense economic and other progress, but have been the stumbling block to a more harmonious evolution of our societies and of international cooperation. We need to overcome this, and we need, well, to grow more mature ourselves, the citizens, in order to show to our politicians that for them, if they are short-sighted, they will lose the elections, not that they will win the elections. So it's very much in our hands.
You talk, I was reminded of what Dag Hammarskjöld said many years ago, talking about the role of the United Nations not being to take mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell. And the purpose is, of course, to build back in a positive way, not to destroy in a continuing way. The last point that Matthias raised was about getting out of silos. And you mentioned that in 2022, I'll be taking over as president of the British Medical Association. And one of my goals for that presidency will be precisely to do that. I'm going to be arguing that we need to get health professionals to be engaging with people like you, people like the other commissioners. On the commission, we had 2 former prime ministers, 3 former presidents, other people politicians who had not been working in health. So what is your advice for we have a brilliant group of young Gasteiners coming through. What is your advice for them to get them out of their silos so that they can engage with people like you?
Well, that is a great idea, Martin. Maybe for the young health professionals. By the way, with some of them, Alexandra and I had a very, very productive dialogue organized by WHO Europe just on the day of the presentation to the press of our report. But I think, for example, why doesn't the British Medical Association, under your leadership, you could set up experimentally a group, a mixed group composed of some highly promising and critically minded young health professionals with maybe somebody that a sister association in political sciences could provide to you. So a mixed group, and you could have, now I'm totally inventing, I was not aware of this potential question, and maybe over the course of 1 year, these people from two walks of life could work together and invite some experienced people, not me. I will be honored to be among the public, to have hybrid discussions.
Be in touch. So we've run out of time. Can I just say thank you very much indeed, Mario, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you to Alexandra as well for contributing, and to Matthias and to Floris. And at this stage, I'll now pass over for the remainder of this final plenary session to Anya, who will be taking us through a panel discussion on a new social contract. Thank you very much indeed.
Chair Martin McKee and also Mario Monti for that really enlightening discussion. And I think we'll be exploring some of the themes you talked about in our panel coming up now. My name is Anya Sitharam. I'm a former BBC World News presenter and former ITN Health and Science correspondent. And since leaving news, I've been making documentaries, many on health and environment. And also, I've just realized this is the 4th visit I've had to Gastein, and hopefully the next one could be in person. So to continue with the theme of the new social contract, it's obviously not just an idea that's been raised by Clemens Auer, but many leading organizations, think tanks, academics, and recently the UN Secretary General suggested a new social contract could be a means of tackling the inequalities exposed by COVID-19. And it's a topic our panel will be discussing shortly. But before we do that, obviously, I want to ask you, if there were to be a new social contract, what would you put in it? So if you could go to Slido and to help us design it and answer the next poll, what should form the basis of a new social contract? So do keep your thoughts coming in there. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel to you. So our speakers are Janez Pokula, Minister of Health, Republic of Slovenia, Sharon Burrow, General Secretary, International Trade Union, and they are the world's biggest trade union. They have a membership of 87 million. Colom Cahen Salvador is the co-founder and co-executive director of Atlas, which describes itself as a global progressive social and political movement. And also Sophie Howe, who is Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and she's described as by the Guardian newspaper as the world's first minister for the unborn. So welcome to all of our panel. Let's see if any answers are coming in, first of all, before we go to them. What should form the basis of a new social contract? And health universal coverage, inclusiveness, solidarity, transparency, inclusion, communitarian society. That's interesting because solidarity, equity, and inclusion were three words that came up in building forward better, but here we're seeing community ownership, communitarian society. So the idea of a community working together, and also very importantly, intergenerational issues. And the main theme that's coming through is solidarity. So, okay, keep those answers coming in. Keep thinking about it. Let's go to our panelists now, and I'd like to welcome Janez Pokljuka, Minister of Health for Slovenia. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to all of you, Sophie Howe, Sharon Burrow, and Kolomka Salvador. Janez Pokljuka, first of all, can I ask you the first question? First of all, do you think there should be a new social contract? And if so, what would be the principles behind it?
Anya, thank you for these words and question. Hello to everyone. It is important to know that I'm speaking from the perspective of an European country that has social and healthcare system built on strong social foundation. Keeping this in mind, I would say that when redefining the social contract, we should not lose some of the core social pillars that have been already established in the past. On the other hand, we also cannot deny that over the years we have seen increasing needs of social and healthcare services, for example, in long-term care, which means that current financing models may not be sufficient in next year. Rethinking the social contract from the perspective of healthcare systems is also reflected as a priority of Slovenian presidency. Our aim is to identify opportunities for working together in finding innovative solutions in this regard. I believe that main principles for our health systems remain solidarity, equity, universal access, and quality of care. I would add the principles of community participation and in-sectoral collaboration. Most of those have been very well defined already in the Alma-Ata Declaration in 1978. The present COVID crisis has shown how important it is to have a strong primary healthcare. Our experience is that primary healthcare is best placed to address the needs of population at the community level in crises such as COVID-19. In Slovenia, primary healthcare is without referral and free of charge. In recent years, we have invested in additional services in primary healthcare to better address the specific need of most vulnerable population. To conclude, yes, we need to consider a new social contract that would build on already existing values and would encourage investments in the development and implementation of innovative solutions addressing the changing needs. Thank you, Anya.
Thank you very much, Minister. And interesting that you say that current financing models may not be sufficient, and health and building forward better is a priority of the Slovenian presidency, looking at innovative solutions. And you mentioned the word community there, again, community participation and intersectoral participation there. So I would like to ask our next speaker, Sharon Burrow, welcome to you. So obviously you want a new social contract. That's a given. What would you put in it?
Well, the minister's right that you can't have a resilient future without universal health, access to health freely available for everybody. But we have a convergence of crises, and we need to deal with all of them in an interrelated manner, as you heard Mr. Monti say. So for working people, we want to know that there are jobs, jobs and jobs, a return to the ambition of full employment, with indeed the proviso they're climate-friendly jobs, with just transition, because this sector has to transition if we're to stabilise the planet. We want to see a rights space. People have to have the dignity and the respect of human and labour rights. And of course, we want to see due diligence for companies and the impunity of oppression from the major corporations, particularly in our supply chains. But we need to see a universal social protection guarantee, and that means health. It means education. It means, care, childcare, aged care, those fundamental services. But it also means the dignity of decent pensions and unemployment benefits and child-related benefits, all of those things that make people feel security against current and future shocks. We must have equality, income, of course, but also gender and race. Women have lost $800 billion throughout the pandemic. That's about the average or the combined GDP of 98 countries. So we must do better. Young people cannot be excluded. And so that brings me to something that came up very strongly, and that's inclusion. If we don't realise an inclusive future, if we don't realise the SDGs, we don't deal with climate so we meet the test of the Paris Climate Agreement, we are simply sealing our fate at continuing to be a conflicted a society where people feel despair and anger and don't trust their governments or each other. So all those things that you saw people put in a new social contract, while I've outlined the 5 demands for workers, I think people should design what they want for themselves, their communities, their families, their children, and let's create a solidarity around this.
So you said jobs, 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 and climate-friendly jobs, and climate was a word that came up in the last poll about building forward better. But we've seen loss of jobs during the pandemic, and people are coming off their safety nets of furlough all over the place. Here in the UK, this month, people are not going to be paid for by the government because they aren't in work. So how is that going to happen?
We have to take a collective decision to invest in jobs. The UN Secretary General took a magnificent step forward. He's listened to people, and he's building a global accelerator for jobs and social protection. Because if people can't earn income, and where they are, as you say, unemployed or they're sick, if they have that fundamental income, then why do we grow wealth? Why do we build wealth if we're not prepared to share it and look after each other, whether it's health or income or other areas that are fundamental to a society that is strong and resilient?
Thank you very much. Sophie, welcome to you. What did you think of the points that people put in the word cloud, and what would you put in a new social contract?
Well, I think that what was in the word cloud was very close to the sort of things that I would include. But I guess that the fundamental thing that I think we need to include in a new social contract is the good ancestor test. So are the decisions that we're taking today going to help or hinder our children, our grandchildren, and those future generations yet to be born to live better lives? Are we leaving the world better than we found it? That's got to be the mission of all policymakers across the world. And I think that in Wales we have a framework to do that. So the first country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations. And whilst that overarching principle or obligation on all of our institutions in Wales, including our government, is to demonstrate how they're acting to meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. There are three other important elements actually, in that legislation. So first of all, the setting out of a set of 7 national long-term goals. Now, you wouldn't think that that was kind of revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals. But actually, if you ask the average person on the street, surely our governments, our world must have a sort of mission that we're working towards. Of course, the UN SDGs are exactly that. But on a nation level, it is quite revolutionary because we are embroiled and have been embroiled for decades and centuries even in short-term politics. So it tends to be the fact that our goals are, from one parliamentary term or one set of elections to the next. But in Wales, we have 7 long-term goals which don't change as governments may change. And the obligations on those governments to set out how they're going to maximise their contribution to those 7 goals, also critically important. And then there are 5 ways of working which our institutions are now audited on how they deploy these 5 ways of working. And when the minister who took our legislation through our national parliament was passing this legislation, he described it as the Common Sense Act. Why is he legislating for common sense? Sadly, you can see by the fact that we are, just a few years away from catastrophic damage to our planet, that actually common sense hasn't particularly prevailed. You can see by the fact that around 63 people in the world hold the same amount of wealth as about 3.6 billion people, that common sense hasn't necessarily prevailed. But those 5 principles by which our organisations now have to work is demonstrating how they're considering the long-term impact of the things that they're doing and preparing for future trends and scenarios. Now, what place might we be in, both in terms of the pandemic, which, by the way, the risk of a global pandemic been in the top 10 of the global risk registers for very many years, and yet seemingly has taken us all by surprise, described as one of those black swan moments, but probably not black swan at all. Likewise, in terms of the climate crisis. So that forward thinking and planning and looking at future trends and scenarios critical. Preventing problems from occurring or getting worse is the second principle. Again, we tend to find money, as we say in the UK, find money down the back of the sofa when we need to, when there's a crisis. But actually, we should be preventing those problems from happening in the first place. So when we talk about universal access to healthcare, absolutely critically important, but let's have universal access to a national, international wellness system, which focuses on prevention and doing the things that keep people well in the first place. That leads me to the third point, which is integration, because we know that the majority of things that keep people well are actually outside of our healthcare systems. So they're things like, are we living in areas of high air pollution? What is the quality of our jobs? So we want decent work. What is the quality of our social interaction and our relationships? Are we one of the, hundreds of thousands of people who are living in loneliness and therefore likely to have our life expectancy shortened? So those, what have often been described as the kind of softer things, are absolutely crucial to people's health and well-being. And that point on integration means that all of our institutions, so whether you're Natural Resources Wales, our Environment Agency, whether you're the National Health Service, whether you're the Economy Department in government, you have a responsibility to deliver all 7 of our well-being goals. You have a responsibility to deliver health, resilient ecosystems, a resilient and prosperous economy, which doesn't reference GDP, by the way. You have an obligation to deliver cohesive communities. And then the final 2 areas, working together, because no one institution can achieve these long-term aims on their own, and critically involving people in that decision-making process. So I think that those provide the kind of hallmarks of a new social contract for both current and future generations. And then the final critical point to make is you need someone to oversee that, because what we're trying to achieve here is unpicking the habits of very many lifetimes of short-termism, of spending in silos, of spending on the acute, and we need to unpick that if we're going to do the right thing and be good ancestors.
Okay, that's lovely. Just very briefly, Sophie, so has Wales got a new social contract, and is it binding? Just very briefly.
Wales has a new social contract through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It's a law, not a policy, so cannot easily be changed, and we're already starting to see it make significant impact.
Thank you very much for that. So, Colombe, we heard there from Sophie, there is already a new social contract in Wales. Do you think to have a new social contract, we would need a new kind of politics?
First of all, wow, I completely admire what Wales is doing, and I can't wait to read more about it. I think those are the type of best practices we need to implement across the world. Do we need a new type of politics? Definitely. I think the current political system is not working in order to create a new social contract. We see it post-pandemic and during the pandemic. The pandemic has shed light on so many key social issues, and we're supposed to be recovering right now and beginning to move forward, yet the same old is already happening. If you look at today's world, 60% of the European population has been double vaxxed already, and many will start receiving boosters. And in Africa, you have less than 4% of the population that has been vaccinated. A new social contract needs to be global, needs to be democratic, and needs to be equitable. And as such, we need a new political system, because the current one is looking at national interests first, always, and this cannot work anymore. This pandemic has proven it many, many times. In addition, I mean, on the list of issues with the current political system, I could go on for way longer than my allocated time, but we see that some groups are systematically kept out of politics, those being, for example, in Europe, the youth, women, minorities, and others, which means that policymaking is losing in a lot of interesting insights and better decision making. So we need a new political system that enables inclusion, enables different voices to come in, and enables us to look at the world through different lenses, through global lenses, as we are all interlinked. And for this, we need to create a new global structure, a global democratic governance, where people like you and I can vote, make our voices heard, and as a result, define a new social contracts for all. And just to conclude, I heard in Mario Monti's panel how the European Union had the European Union's response was a success, which honestly shocked me quite a bit. When you look at the social contract, the European Union did not prepare properly for a pandemic, and as we've heard, it was always one of the top 10 risks. It did not deal with the pandemic in an equitable manner, holding doses and refusing to have a TRIPS waiver. So this shows once more that we need a new way of approaching global crisis, which is non-national or Euro-nationalistic, including the rest of the world, to make sure that we can all have better and more equitable lives.
So very briefly, what is this new body that you're suggesting? How can you have a global body where everyone is included?
I would say let's change the way global governance works. The UN is often not dealing properly with global crisis. We saw it with the pandemic and with the fact that the WHO did not have enough power or competences to be able to deal with it. So we need an alternate body, which is democratic, so global governance, a global state where citizens get to participate and elect their representatives, and that have enough competences to be able to deal with global topics such as pandemic, but also climate change, fiscal injustice, the rights of future generation. I'm thrilled to hear that Wales is doing so well on this, but the truth is future generations in Wales will also be impacted by the rest of the world and how they are not addressing those rights. So we need to create this body. It's a difficult thing to do, which is why at Atlas we are working on getting people in power all across the world through elections and activism campaign so that we can create a digital global governance system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lots to think about there. So let's see what you've been asking in response to some of the things our speakers have been saying. So Matthias, the young Gasteiner there, what have people been asking?
Thank you, Anya. So interestingly, a couple of questions out there, both on Twitter and Slido, relating to the relationship of a potential new social contract and money, or even big money. So we've got a young Gasteiner, Michele Calabro, asking on Twitter, could the Health and Finance Economic G20 board represent a way forward to finally improve how health and economy and finance could start to speak the same language in view of a potential new social contract? So that's one of the questions out there. And we've also got questions about the relationship between the social contract and commercial actors. So in the framing of this session, in the definition of social contract, I believe it was written that it's the agreement of everyone with everyone to further the common good. And the questions we've got are regarding partnerships with commercial actors, acknowledging that, of course, some of them can be an important element of reaching such a social contract or such an agreement, but that there are some powerful commercial actors, and I guess, tobacco, alcohol, some food or extractive industries come to mind, whose bottom line is irreconcilable with public health priorities. What should be our approach vis-a-vis such stakeholders, and how do we make sure we can achieve a social contract while not compromising on our public health values? So those are the voices out there at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Mateus. Let me put a couple of those questions to our panel. Sharon Burrow, do you think Health and Finance G20 board can be a blueprint of how to get health and finance to speak the same language? Is that even possible? I think you need to switch your microphone on.
Oh, that's the crime of the virtual world. Sorry about that. We need to have finance ministers talk to health ministers for sure, but environment ministers and indeed labour ministers. There can be no dealing with our current world if we simply continue with silos. But I have to say, the finance ministers are very reluctant. We've tried this at the G20 on several occasions. It's worked, but in fact, you find the next year they go back to their silos. So I agree totally with the people out there saying this should happen. And I also agree indeed with the Commissioner about if you don't integrate these policy areas, if you don't actually have the legislative mandate to take us beyond the short term, then the kind of ambition that Sophie outlined and the demand appropriately for a global governance system that works, it's not possible. So we do have to think about not just the future, the good ancestor test, but what you do to start today.
Oh, but the ECB, for instance, has lent the Eurozone 1.2 trillion in 2020. Finance ministers are going to be thinking about how they're going to pay that back. It's their job not to spend too much.
Well, if we don't get beyond a lens of short-term austerity, if we don't look at the capital that we have, and we have spent trillions of dollars on the response to the pandemic, if we spent that kind of money on an integrated approach, not just to health, but also to climate, to jobs, we've got a jobs deficit of about 575 million jobs in the formal economy. There's around 2 billion people desperately trying to survive in the informal economy. This makes up a broken global labour force. It wouldn't cost anything like that to actually fill the gap. About 80 million people in health and care, about the same amount in education, about 100 plus million in the various climate demands from infrastructure through to, rebuilding our carbon sinks, to transitioning our economies. And we could reach the SDG 8 goal then of full employment and decent work. But if we don't look at patient capital and patient debt, then we're not going to invest in the future, and we will not rebuild our democracies that people increasingly don't trust. And that's just tragic.
Thank you very much, Sharon Burrow there. And just one other question, and perhaps Columb, I'd come to you on this. Are there actors that should be excluded from a social contract? For instance, unhealthy things?
So I think from the moment you want an equitable social contract, some actors need to be excluded. One, I think that some countries in the making of this new social contract need to be excluded. I'm thinking of authoritarian countries that crack down systematically on some parts of their population. I don't see how you can have a sustainable and equitable social contract that is being redefined while some people are subject to a genocide. I'm thinking, for example, of China and the Uyghurs. And then obviously in a social contract, you need to regulate some big companies and other sectors of societies that create an extremely unhealthy situation for the planet, for society, and for the humans. And for this, I think this is when, again, the global aspect comes into play. A lot of those companies are multinationals that are either not being taxed or regulated properly across the world today because of a lack of a global tax system. And I think this is when we need to go beyond the national level or simply the G20 level and look at it through a global level.
Okay, while you're there, I just wanted to ask you, let's look at climate, because that's something that is on all our minds, and COP26 is next month. Do you think that the chances for a greener recovery are better now? Do you think world leaders are actually going to pull it off, Colombe?
I would love to say yes. I would really love to say yes, and I hope it will be the case. I hope that COP will get enough attention to shame a lot of the leaders that are not meeting their climate agreements and promises, which is most of the world leaders. Unfortunately, what we tend to see at those climate conferences is a lot of talk and very, very little work. And I think for this to change, we need to change the way we approach climate as well. The problem, with national leaders talking about climate change is climate is always a very sexy topic during election periods. It always plays very well, and that's because over 60% of the world population believes that climate is an emergency. But often, as soon as new governments are in power, you see the lowering of climate ambitions. It's the case in my home country, where France has been held guilty of climate inaction. For this to change, I think you need to be able to have longer term plans put into place. So I really like the Welsh example that we had of the long-term goals that cannot just be changed by one government coming into play. But I think we also need to up ambitions. And for this, we need to look at innovative ways of making decisions. So far, national governments have been completely unable, to deal with the climate crisis. And we see it. Every year it gets worse. So since they are not capable of taking drastic decisions in order to solve it, we need to give the power to the people. So what I mean by this is, let's, for example, consider doing citizens' assemblies that are binding on all countries at conferences like COP, so that we come out with a common set of policies that have then to be implemented, instead of having a lot of discussions about how climate is an emergency, and it is, but at the end of the day, having countries not meet their ambitions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Colombe. So let's move on now. And you also mentioned, Colombe, the inequalities around the world between young and old, different regions, different countries. Yanis Poklukar, as I said at the beginning, the pandemic has highlighted health inequalities. So what needs to be done to address the uneven nature of recovery within countries and regions and also populations?
Anya, thank you for the question. Indeed, looking at the data, we can see that vulnerable groups are carrying the heaviest burden during the pandemic. For example, patients with chronic conditions who are also more likely to develop serious COVID symptoms are more common in vulnerable populations. Vulnerability is a very multi-sectoral challenge, as pointed out already by Sharon. Slovenian experience is that this can best be done at community level, close to where people live and work. So in Slovenia, we have mobilized social services, local administration, civil society to identify the specific needs of vulnerable populations. Their role was to offer support in terms of assessing COVID-related services, such as testing and vaccination, and other services related to their chronic conditions. In general, we should aim to empower people and assure health literacy in all population groups. Here I see a lot of opportunities for international collaboration in developing innovative approaches and in sharing good practices. We should also consider how to best use existing mechanisms of the EU level in doing so. Our common investment should be evidence-based and should efficiently address health and societal inequities. So I think that that's the most important, these three things.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. Let's find out what Floris the cartoonist has been up to. I know he's got some more lined up to show us. Floris, let's see the cartoons. Well, I hope our leaders are a bit more proficient at forward planning and building forward better than Floris's cartoons would suggest. I'm going to move on now in our panel discussion. We've heard a lot about Wales, and I'm very interested to hear more about the idea of the well-being culture, the fact that it's in a priority, well-being is a priority in Wales, and Wales is a part of the well-being economic government, WEGO, which includes Finland, Scotland, Iceland and New Zealand. Sophie Howe, they're all quite small countries. Do you think this kind of well-being thinking could actually work anywhere else, somewhere bigger?
Yes, I think it could, but I think it's worth giving that recognition to some of the small nations who are actually punching way above their weight in terms of this shift towards well-being economics. But I think that we've shown we have some factors in Wales. We're a nation of just over 3 million people, so it's easier to get stuff done in Wales, if you like. But also, it's a good test bed for trying out new things. And I think it's no surprise that certainly some of those countries, Finland, for example, generally tops most of the indicators in terms of well-being, in terms of good health, in terms of good prospects for people, in terms of inequality and so on. And so I think that there is something certainly to learn from small countries. In fact, if you listen to Jeffrey Sachs, a lead economist, advisor to a number of UN Secretary Generals, he says if you want to see where the good stuff is happening, look to the small countries. And I think although, we tend to focus on those the large and powerful countries, actually, some of those larger and powerful countries, I think particularly about the United States, have, more endemic problems than any of us have in terms of health inequality, in terms of poverty, and so on. And if it's the mission of our world leaders, to improve the prospects of their citizens, then actually there's a lot to be learned from those smaller countries.
So one of the things about Wales, though, is there is still a lot of poverty in Wales. There was a report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently, which highlighted the fact that the situation's obviously worsened in the pandemic. So I think some people would ask, do these priorities actually help alleviate poverty?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And in Wales, we suffer somewhat from the powers of our devolved administration. So social security rests with the UK government, made up of a different political party, and some of the policies of that government, particularly in terms of welfare reform and social security, have had a real direct impact across the UK, but specifically in Wales, where poverty has been a long-term challenge. That's not to say that because the Welsh Government don't have powers around social security that they should wash their hands of this issue. And actually, there are a range of interesting things starting to emerge. So our First Minister, based on some advice that I provided and his long-term interest in the issue, has now committed to piloting a universal basic income. And I think that's interesting for a number of reasons. One, what can the Welsh Government do in terms of alleviating poverty? Two, although a universal basic income is costly, coming back to the points I think Sharon was making, if we don't make those connections in terms of short-term cost to, and long-term gain, if we started looking at things holistically and we mapped through how much money we're spending in our healthcare system to patch people up when they're ill, and how much of that is actually related to poverty, how much money we're spending in our social care system to care for people whose needs have not been addressed earlier on. Actually, when we start thinking about some quite radical solutions like a universal basic income, the numbers start to look a lot less scary. The other thing, of course, around universal basic income is the fact that the world of work is changing more rapidly than it ever has before, and there's every chance that and this is where our future trends and scenarios thinking comes in. There's every chance that people will, lose jobs, lose parts of jobs, and so on. And actually, although, good quality jobs are good for people's health, I think that there's a conversation to be had around, do we all want to be working, 9 to 5, 37 hours a week, and so on? When actually, could we be valuing instead not how much money we are earning through working, but could the state be valuing actually we're going to supplement you to spend your time in your community. We're going to supplement you through a universal basic income to think about how you might be able to help us meet the needs of and demands of care in the future. We're going to supplement you to be able to walk to school and so on.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to bring in Sharon Burrow there then, because you said jobs, jobs, jobs. And what about a universal basic income, or the fact that we don't want to be working 9 to 5 every day? In fact, since the pandemic, a lot of people have given up their jobs and decided to live a different type of lifestyle. And if you could keep your answer quite brief, because we've only got about another 10 minutes or so.
Well, I just want to say bravo, Sophie. And indeed, these smaller nations should be celebrated. Most of them are led by women, just a small point there, but they are more thoughtful about inclusion and about the long term. So yes, indeed, universal basic income is part of the mix of what we think is a social protection floor. If you are not in work, I don't need basic income because I have a very good job with just wages, but other people do, and I do think we should be valuing care. It should indeed be choices, whether there's formal care or you're going to provide informal care, and it should be seen as part of a working week. These debates are way beyond time. We should have decent work, whether it's indeed 35 or 37 hours or 30 hours. These are societal choices. And if we invest in people and we invest in the planet, we can start repairing the social fabric as well as the environment that gives people that hope of a wellness-based future. So absolutely. And can I say to Cologne that her voice is critical as well, because as a young advocate, talking about the responsibilities of government and the involvement of people, we can only say again, Thank you, and please raise your voice loud and clear.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Colombe, I'd like to ask you, is there a country, do you think, that handled the pandemic well?
I think in terms of health, there are a lot of best practices that we can learn from. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea were some of the countries, I believe, that dealt with it better just because they were better prepared based on past pandemics. I think Taiwan was a very interesting model. It managed to keep civil liberties at an all-time high while dealing with the pandemic, which has been a rare exception this year. It has also kept cases very, very low. And then, of course, you have the very well-known examples of New Zealand and so on. My only issue with how a lot of those countries have dealt with the pandemic is that they have closed the country to the rest of the world. And while border controls may be necessary on the short term, while people don't have access to vaccines, it's not sustainable. And this, again, because we see that a large part of the world still does not have access to even a first dose of the vaccine, while the rest of the world is going back to almost business as usual, which in turn means, from a health perspective, more risk of variants, less herd immunity, but also increased economic inequalities between countries, people, and regions.
Thank you very much. And so, Yannis Popular, what has the COVID-19 crisis taught you about preparing the health systems and society for the wider shocks that the emergency brought?
Thank you for a question. Looking from a health perspective, I would point out that our health system have been under the enormous pressure of the COVID-19 pandemic. Consequently, we have seen a lot of potential for innovation and flexibility within the systems. The good news is that pandemic has forced us to implement digital solutions much faster than we expect. On the other hand, the pandemic has brought to the surface the enormous needs of population of mental health services. And this is an area that would need appropriate investments right away. Looking from the wider political perspective, I hope that the pandemic has taught us that investments in health systems should be recognized as a cost-saving measure that benefits our society and economies in a long run. A strategic approach to the investments in development and implementation of health innovations is crucial for the future sustainability and resilience of European health systems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poklukar. So we're coming towards the end, but just before we do wrap up and think about what you want people to take home after this discussion, let's go over to Matthias in the newsroom and see what people have been saying.
Thank you, Anya. So people have been, both on Twitter and on Slido, have been emphasizing the importance of ethical approaches to solving public health crises, and in particular, Colombe's point on approaching global health crisis in a non-nationalistic way without closing down, but working for the health of all. Global health is something that resonated on Twitter. We've also had a related point on Slido. I guess it would be a question to Professor Monti, if you are still with us, is on whether the Commission engaged with representatives of marginalized people to develop recommendations. And the voice on Slido has pointed to a Nobody Left Outside coalition resource about the importance of involving marginalized people in public health interventions. So as I said, this importance of ethical approaches is something that the audience, that really has resonated with the audience from this panel.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for that. And thank you very much for the audience for sending in your questions and also tweeting about this panel discussion. So we're going to come to the wrap up now. And we've heard so much there about getting out of silos, about not having short-termism, about the inspiring example of Wales with its legislation, which has put well-being at front and centre of its priorities. I just wanted to go round the room again and ask you just to think of one thing you'd like the audience to take away from this session. So I will start with you again, Mr. Poklukar. What one thing should the audience take away from this?
Thank you, Anya. I would like to thank you and all for inviting me to this important panel discussion. For my final message, I would refer to my previous points. So first, I want to say, to assure a sustainable future, we have to build on existing values and invest in innovative solutions to ensure that our health systems will be more agile in addressing the changing needs of people. Secondly, we have to think globally but act locally in an integrated way. And last point, we need to invest now to save in the future. Anya, thank you. That's from my side.
Thank you very much for that. And let's now go to Colombe. What one thing should people take away?
I think it's the fact that we are at a juncture in history right now. It's very clear to most people that the current system is not working well enough. And we spoke about a lot of the downfalls today, from the recovery to inequalities created and light shed on inequalities during the pandemic. However, it's not yet completely clear what the new social contract will be like. And it's normal. I think that in any stage in history, when you are about to have a big change, a type of revolution, the next steps are not always clear. But this new social contract needs to be equitable and it needs to be global. And for this, I think that it's on all of us and everyone present in the audience to engage and make it a reality, to have those discussions and come up with solutions, and to share the amazing best practices we heard about today.
Thank you very much. And Sharon Burrows, a final thought from you.
Well, if we don't put people and the planet at the center of recovery and build that resilience for everybody, everyone must be included, then we will be indeed failing the good ancestor test that Sophie challenged us with.
Wonderfully succinct. Thank you very much, and a good thing to take away. And finally, Sophie, apart from your good ancestor test, what's your final message?
Well, I suppose apply the common sense test along with the good ancestor test. So demonstrate how you're thinking and planning for the long term, prevent problems from occurring, integrate, so get outside of your silos, involve and include people, and collaborate with others to build progressive alliances.
Thank you very much. And just before we go, we have two more cartoons to look at, perhaps to take away the messages from those cartoons. Can we have them, please? And you know, I can't read the left-hand one because for some reason I can see myself over it, but I'm sure you can. But I think it must say something about climate change. And I'll put it at the top of the list. Right, okay. And the next one. Right, okay. Well, I think we know what that means as well. So thank you very much. I would just like to thank our wonderful speakers for their really thoughtful and inspiring contributions, and lots to think about there. So thank you all very much for your time today. It's been really, really interesting to talk to you. And just to say thank you to the audience as well for watching. And there's much more coming up today on this theme. We've got two more sessions that are going to deep dive into the topics of well-being and resilient recovery. They have a healthier future for all, creating fairer, healthier and more resilient post-pandemic societies, and that's organized by the Health Foundation. And we've also got the economy of a well-being revolution, a new paradigm for future fit funding, and that's organized by Euro Health Net and Nordic Health 2030 movement. So lots more to watch. Don't go away, but when you do, have a wonderful weekend, and thank you very much for watching.